Hi friends, welcome to week 2 of the Tulip Cottage Quilt Along. Last week we talked about how to make the most of that pre-cut pack and to start cutting your pieces. And this week we are going to start piecing our blocks together. This video will be in 2 parts. Part 1 I'm sharing today, which is piecing the tulip portion of the block, and then part 2 I'll share next week, which is piecing the leaf portions of the block. In this video today, I will share with you my technique that I use to get a nice clean point at the center of that tulip. I'll also talk about how to stay organized as you're sewing. I'm going to be using the denim sparkler fabric as my background fabric. I think it just shows up better on camera than some of the other fabrics. Also, I have kind of redone my setup a little bit. If you guys have done any of the quilt alongs in the past, I have an iron now where I can show you a video of the ironing so that you can kind of see pressing wise which seams I press to the side, which seams I press open, how I nest my seams to get those nice crisp blocks. So hopefully you have all of your pieces cut out and you are ready to start sewing along with me today. Are you guys ready to start sewing? Today we're going to be working on the top portion of the tulip block, which I'm calling the tulip petals section. These in the pattern are referred to as the petals. This is referred to as the tulip center, and then the stem and the leaves, which we'll get to next week. When I made this quilt, I've made it a few times, I prefer to piece all of the top of the tulips together and then all of the stems and then sew the pieces together. I just think it goes a little bit quicker. I want to go over a little bit about the setup I have today. So I have a small iron, which is my Olicio M3 Pro iron. I have a wool cutting mat, I have a wool pressing mat. And then I have the June Taylor pressing mat cutting board combo underneath. The reason that this is here underneath is that I have in the past used only a wool pressing mat, and the heat does transfer to your table. And just to kind of prevent any sort of scorching or warping or anything, that I've decided I use this underneath, and it really helps as a nice insulator. I also have a fabric safe marking pen. This is the friction pen. This pen is actually designed for erasable ink on paper, but I find it works great with fabric. It disappears with heat, which is perfect since you're ironing so much when you're quilting. I also want to mention I live in Kentucky and we have got some really good storms coming through today, so you may see a few flashes of light. I try to film on days where the weather is sunny and stable, but Murphy's Law is that there always is a storm that blows through right when I pull out the video camera. So anyway, back to the quilt. I'm going to be following along with the pattern. If you don't have the pattern already, you can grab it in our shop. We have printed and digital copies available for you. I have already cut out a lot of my tulip petals and tulip center fabrics and some of my background fabrics. I have also, for my background fabrics, before I cut them out, I starched them. If you've already cut them out, you can still starch them. I've noticed that the starch is still very helpful even after the fabric has been cut out, but the starch just kind of gives the fabric a little extra crispness, will hold the folds that we're going to make in the fabric better, cleaner cut lines and things like that. A stack of background fabrics, stack of petal fabrics, and a stack of tulip center fabrics. So I'm going to set this aside. So I don't have my entire stack of tulip petal fabrics here just because I don't want to overwhelm you, but you've probably got a really big stack of cut fabrics to be used for your tulip centers. The first thing you want to do is you want to sort these into the right and the left. Of the tulip block, we construct the left side and the right side separately and then sew them together. And to allow for enough variation in your project, I like to try and have the same number of like pink flower prints in each right and left pile. So this will kind of help with the variation in the quilt, and so that your colors kind of you don't end up with like all the blues in one place and all the pinks in one place. So I will do a quick sort. And I'm just trying to keep about the same. Now, it won't be exactly the same because we cut 3 pieces for the tulip petals from one of those 10-inch squares, but we're just trying to get like a general sort going on. So take a minute, sort those into right and left piles, and then we're going to work on one side at a time. We're going to follow the pattern as it says, and we're going to start page 3 of the printed pattern. I believe it is page 4 of the digital pattern, where it says section 1 tulip block top. We actually don't need these pieces quite yet. We're going to start by making half square triangles for the tulip centers. So to make a tulip center, you're going to have 1 piece of background fabric and 1 piece of print fabric. You're going to layer them right sides facing, and then using your marking pen and a ruler, you're going to draw a diagonal line down the center of one of those pieces. It doesn't matter which one, just whichever one will show up better in your finished project. And then we're going to sew on a 1/4 inch on each side of the line that we drew. So in order for this technique to work properly, you need to know where the 1/4 inch mark is on your sewing machine foot. So I know with my sewing machine foot that this edge right here is a 1/4 inch. There's lots of different ways that you can check to make sure you're at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I also use seam tape on my machine. This is by Allison of Cluck Cluck Sew. You just line up the center red line with the hole in your stitch plate, and then you have a 1/4 inch on each side. Then as I sew, when I want to make sure that I'm a 1/4 inch off to the side, I can line up the edge, the bottom corner of this piece with that black line as I sew. So I've kind of got like a double insurance that I'm at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, there you can see that sewn a 1/4 inch on each side of the seam. If you are, if you've never done this before, I recommend making 1 test block so you understand what you're doing. Then after that, I think it's quicker to chain piece these, and chain piece just means you run 1 piece through and then the next and the next. And I do have a short video on chain piecing that I will link up here in the video that explains that technique a little better, but it will save you quite a bit of time when you're making this quilt. The next thing you need to do is we need to cut these pieces apart along that drawn line, like so. Then you need to press them and open them up. So I prefer to always press with the background fabric facing up, and then flip that to the right side, like so. There you have 2 half square triangles of background fabric and 1 of your print fabrics. Now these are not the right size. One of the downsides of making half square triangles using this method is that you do need to square them up afterwards. Actually, I recommend you always square up a half square triangle, because since the seam is on the bias, and the bias is like the 45-degree, it stretches. So it will have a tendency to distort and lose its square nature as you sew. So I definitely do not skip this step, otherwise your blocks will not line up. So I'm using a block lock ruler. You can also use a standard quilt ruler. You just need to know where 3.5 inch marking is. I prefer the block lock rulers because they have a groove. See if I can get the camera to kind of pick that up. There's a groove down the center that allows it to lock into the seam like that, so that you know it's not going to slide as much back and forth as you trim. And it also, like if I were to put this way, there's a little bit of wobble with the ruler because of the bulk of that seam, but this helps to eliminate that wobble. You just have to make sure you get it going the right direction. Then you just trim. And the size to trim it to is noted in the pattern. There's one of them trimmed. And this is another thing that you can do in bulk. Just sit in front of the TV, put on a good show, and trim all of your half square triangles at the same time. I also love these rotating cutting mats for trimming these. Makes it so much quicker. I've moved most of the other pieces of fabric off my cutting mat, just so it's kind of clear how I stay organized during this portion of the pattern. So this is not all, this is only 3 of them, but as you do this, you're going to end up with a big pile of sewn half square triangles. You want to, just like we put these pieces into right and left piles, I recommend putting these pieces into right and left piles. There are not nearly as many variations of prints for the tulip centers as there were for the tulip petals. So I have an odd number here because I made a sample, so I'll just go left and right and left. And then we're going to take all the ones that are in the right side pile and we're going to put them over in the pile with the right side petal pieces. So I've got the left side petal pieces here, left side tulip center pieces here, and we're ready to move on to the next step of the pattern, which is step 2, create the left side of the tulip block. You're going to need to make sure for this portion of the pattern that you are paying attention to your diagram. On the diagram, this is your tulip center fabric. This is your background fabric, and then this is your petal fabric, just to kind of differentiate that for you guys. So you need to begin by drawing a diagonal line on the wrong side of one of those trimmed and sewn half square triangle pieces. And this time, it does matter which way you draw the diagonal line. You need to draw the diagonal line so it's going the opposite direction of the existing seam. So I got some extra little fabric hitchhikers there. I need to get those trimmed off. Now you're going to take one of your tulip petal pieces from the left side pile. You're going to lay it down, and then using the diagram as a guide, you are going to place this piece there. So I've got mine wrong, see? All right. So I have my tulip center fabric, background fabric, and line, all going the correct direction. This is why it's so important to keep your rights and lefts separate piles, so that when you go to sew everything together, you have the correct number. And also, it's confusing which direction the seam goes on the block. So I think if you work on all of the lefts, then work on all of the rights, your brain just kind of gets used to sewing it a certain way, so you're less likely to get that seam flip-flopped. I'm going to take this to my machine, and this time, instead of sewing on the outside of the drawn line, I'm actually going to sew right along the drawn line. That is sewn. Now you need to trim 1/4 inch on the outside of the drawn line. Make sure you don't trim it on the inside of the drawn line. You want to trim it on the outside of the drawn line. My quilt ruler has a dashed line that marks the 1/4 inch mark, so I just line up that dashed line with this stitched seam and trim. And I want to share a tip with you. So at this point, if you're careful with your trimming and you stay organized, you're going to end up with a lot of these extra little triangles. You can take them after you're done sewing, you know, this quilt if you want to, as long as you keep them like stacked up to each other. You can stitch this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and you'll end up with this cute little kind of variation of a pinwheel block that you could turn into mini quilts or maybe use for a border or some other kind of fun things. If you're someone that likes to use up all your little trimmings, then hopefully you like that tip. This has been trimmed. I'm ready to press. On the pattern, it notes which direction to press the seam. So for the left side, we are going to flip the fabric piece up and we're going to press the seam towards the tulip center fabric, which is this fabric. And there you have the left side of your tulip block. Next, we're going to make the right side of the tulip block, but just like I said, to avoid getting mixed up, I'm going to take all of my left side pieces and I'm going to put them in a pile somewhere else in my sewing room. And then I'm going to get out my set aside right side pieces. All right, so here are my right side pieces for my blocks. And since I'm just making one example block, you'll have a big pile, I think like 35 or something of these. I'm going to make sure that I make this example using a different print of fabric. All right, so we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to draw a diagonal line in the opposite direction of the seam. And then we're going to place it on top of one of our tulip petal pieces. We're going to use the diagram. So this time, the tulip center fabric is there, background fabric is there, and the seam is running in that direction. Going to stitch this and trim it, and then I'll show you how I press it. The piece is stitched and it's ready to be pressed. And as noted on the pattern, this time we are going to press the seam towards the tulip petal fabric, not towards the tulip center fabric. So to do this, most of the time you're accustomed to flipping that up. Just flip it over. So when you press it this time, that tulip petal fabric is up, and then flip it up and press. And then you've got your seam going towards the tulip petal fabric. You're going to keep doing this until you have a big pile of sewn right pieces and a big pile of sewn left pieces. Then we're going to start putting the tulip petals together. At this point, you have a big pile of lefts and rights. Mine aren't all sewn, but I just kind of put them in a pile just to kind of demonstrate for you. Of those right and left pieces, you're going to have tulip centers from all different prints of fabric. In this case, in my quilt, I have 4 different prints. So what you want to do next is you want to pick up one from the right and one from the left pieces that are the same tulip center fabric and different tulip petal fabrics. At this point, I know a lot of you guys are going to want to really, really overthink this, for lack of a better term, but similar to how I made my Heart of Hearts quilt, where we were working with right and left sides of heart blocks, I really think the best way to do this is just kind of grab and go. And before you sew, choose the pieces that go together so that if you need to rearrange things a bit, if you end up with 2 pink cows on top of next to each other, then you can swap them with other pieces. But take a moment and pair up your rights and lefts so that you have the same fabric in the center of the tulip. Now the only thing to do is to sew these 2 pieces together. So the reason we press those seam allowances in opposite directions so is at this point in the construction process, when we put these 2 pieces together, we can nest the seam. And what that means is that one seam is pointing this way and one seam is pointing this way. and you can wiggle that in together, and it will lay those two pieces right on top of each other so that the bulk of the seams are kind of up next to each other, and it like locks it in. And that is the trick to getting a really nice precise point on the center of that tulip. I'm going to pin this in 3 sections like so, and then go to my machine and sew. Those pieces are sewn together, and now we're ready to press them. At this point in the construction process, I do recommend that you press this seam open because there's a lot of bulk there, and I think it helps to reduce the bulk in the seam if you press this center seam open. Let's do that. All right, and at this point, we just have 2 more quick steps for this block. The pattern noted that you cut out a bunch of squares, and you're going to take the squares, the measurement is noted in the pattern, and you're going to draw a diagonal line on 2 of the squares. You're actually going to draw a diagonal line on all of the squares noted in the pattern, but we only need 2 of them for now, so I'm just going to save time, I'll just do 2 of them. But I always think that doing things in bulk and in batch really does save time when quilting. So I would mark all of those at the same time. Now, I'm going to take these and place them on the bottom corners of our tulip so that the seams are pointing out. Couldn't decide which word I wanted to use there. So we're going to, then the same as with this tulip center, we are going to stitch right along the line that we drew. Same as with our other steps, we are going to trim a 1/4 inch on the outside of the stitched line on both sides. And then press. And when working with little kind of stitch and flip corners like this, sometimes they have a tendency to flip up like that. So what I like to do is I have a quilter's clapper I'll keep close by, and I'll just, there, you can see how much that helped get those guys to lay down flat. All right, so your assignment this week is to make all of the tops to your tulips. So if you're making the lap size quilt, that's 28 tulip tops, and if you're making the baby quilt, that is 13 tulip tops. Then next week, I'll walk you through the steps to create the bottom of the block, which features the stems and the leaves of the tulip.